Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we're looking at this, the Sony FE 50mm f1.8, otherwise considered Sony's nifty 50. Every brand has one. Yes, I'm aware that I'm not actually holding it. I traded my copy for a Surface tablet. There you go. So, yeah, another one of these. I did not film myself doing the talking head thing before disabusing myself of this lens, and this is what we get. That being said, we can sort of speed run this part. It's a nifty 50. It's not too complicated. You know, it's light, fits on your camera. It's got a hood, has a front lens element, has a cap. I'm really bad at this. And I will put on screen somewhere what the front filter is. And I believe it has an autofocus manual focus switch. At any rate, this isn't a complicated, nor is it an expensive lens. It might be one that you already have lying around, and they can be used quite effectively. So let's pop in Lightroom and see how this lens does. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here I've got a collection of samples taken with the Sony FE 50mm f1.8. This would be Sony's full-frame nifty 50, affordable 50mm lens with a reasonably fast aperture. Now you might have this lens, because everyone has this lens or one like it at one point or another typically. And yeah, let's see if it's a-okay for astro. To run you through the methodology here, I've got a collection of tracked and a collection of untracked samples. The tracked samples are taken with a Sony a7R Mark V. They are 60-second exposures at ISO 320. The untracked tripod shots are taken with the 50-megapixel Sony Alpha 1 for 15 seconds at ISO 500. Why am I using these two ISO values? Well, because these two cameras are ISO invariant, and using those ISOs represent the essentially second analog amplification stages of those respective cameras, because these cameras only each have two real ISO values, or rather two analog amplification stages. Everything else is actually done digitally in the camera, which is the exact same thing as if I come up here, which I actually will, and bump the exposure in post. However, I get to control this, and if I were to do this or let the camera do this by using a higher ISO value, it will lock that exposure into the file, and I might lose things like some information in my highlights. Rest assured that between whatever the base second ISO is for these cameras and whatever the highest ISO is for these cameras, I will maintain the same ability to raise the shadows, the same general noise level in the image, same image quality. The only difference is I get to retain possibly some highlight information shooting at a lower ISO here. And the caveat here is, of course, if the exposure times and apertures remain the same. This means, and it's not really relevant for these samples, mind you, but this means that if I were to have something bright in frame, like a galaxy or maybe a bright nebula, I might risk blowing out the core of those objects and then having no way to recover that information. So this is why I do this. If you're interested in learning about that in detail, in the description is a link. It'll bring you back to Fervent Astronomy's website, where I have a bunch of information linked, including an article which talks about this. I also have some information on the LighTrack II from Fornax Mounts, which is the tracker that I track these shots on. Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. So if you want some more information about that, by all means, head back to ferventastronomy.com there as well. And you will also find these files, which you can download full raw as samples to assess this lens's performance and assess the processing latitude, et cetera, maybe see what you're really getting out of 60 or 50 megapixels, for instance. So by all means, download them, pixel peep, do all that good stuff, but please respect my copyright. Please use these files for the purpose that I'm providing, which is your personal assessment of these products. Please don't redistribute them online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use these samples as the basis for your own reviews. Just use them in good faith for the purpose that I'm providing them to you for. All that out of the way, we'll take a quick look here at the 1.8 exposure with the Sony Alpha 1. This is a 15-second exposure on a static tripod. And from full viewing distance here, I don't see a ton of star trails or aberrations, but I do see some. And if we zoom in, we can see, well, two things. First, there's star trails. Second, the wind shook the tripod a little bit. It looks like you can see that these have little handles. They almost look like little space pistols or something. And that's due to a bit of vibration in the camera, which basically drew some light trails on the image. That being said, star trails are not that long, so they're not super noticeable even at 50 megapixels. However, they will start to get bad if you drag it out much longer than that. We do have some aberrations here in the corners, which we will talk about, or edges rather. That's best done here with the tracked samples. So right off the jump, we can see that there's vignetting. Of course, with lenses, there's practically always vignetting, and it's pretty dark in the edges there, but it looks like there's probably some recoverable information. The center is a lot brighter. Now keep in mind, we did just boost the brightness of all of these, but this little hot spot in the center might lead to some loss of contrast. So if we stop down, we can see that we lose a little bit of exposure, but only in the center, and this is at f2. You're getting actually a more consistent exposure across the frame here. I don't see any loss in the corners or edges really. 1.8 f2, 1.8 f2, 1.8 f2. So right off the bat, you might consider shooting this lens at f2 just to give yourself more consistent exposure and maybe a little bit of a contrast bump. Let's zoom into the center. Here, yeah, definitely a little loss of contrast. We have some star bloat, so there might be some minor spherical aberrations here, and there is some fringing, although it's a little bit more vibrant than usual. But some chromatic aberration is to be expected. And when we stop down to f2, we see that we do improve our contrast a bit, although the color fringing remains. Let's come out here. Yeah, definite color fringing. So we go to the mid frame. One thing I don't really see is any coma, which is known technically as chromatic aberration. Coma is when stars turn into little wedge shapes with a fuzzy tail. Now, it might not be that extreme. They might be a little bit closer to the star, but they are pretty telltale, and it will lead to a bit of a loss of image quality here because you're getting a little bit of a weirder shape. You'd be getting some loss of contrast, some fuzziness. But in this case, I don't see that happening. We do have some loss of contrast and fuzziness, but that's due to other sort of effects. And as far as coma goes, internal coma, all the fuzzy bits would point towards the center. External, all the fuzzy bits would point towards the edge of the frame. And with respect to coma, chromatic aberration, it's named after coma from comets. So that tail, that fuzzy bit of a tail is meant to be evocative of a comet tail. One thing this lens does have though is astigmatism. Ooh, that's pretty. So here we have some space birds of paradise or something to that effect. And here we've got not only the chromatic aberration, which is causing that color fringing, purpley blue and the bit of the greeny teal there, but we've also got the two types of the astigmatism. Astigmatism lesson, there are, you can imagine, infinite radii from the center to the edge of the frame, and anywhere a star falls along those radii, there's some astigmatism that's going to happen. It will stretch out in that direction and essentially point towards the center, or if you want to imagine that these are birds flying away from the center, then away from the center, but it'll fall along that line. And the star will get stretched out, and this is called tangential astigmatism. The star is essentially not completely focused in a point by the lens, and it's getting stretched out. The wings, in the case of these particular aberrations, these are sagittal astigmatism. So tangential is that one from along a radius to the center of the frame. Sagittal meets it at a 90-degree angle. Of course, here you can see that they're not completely, right out to the sides, but there's a little bit of an angle. They can curve, they can do all kinds of stuff, but they will always be lateral to the tangential astigmatism, and they will always give the impression that they're ringing the frame. If you come to a different part of the frame, you'll find that the orientations are all different. So that's what's happening here. This is astigmatism, and it is not surprising considering that this is an inexpensive 51.8, but it is potentially going to affect how we use this lens because it is quite noticeable. You see here, I can make up the shapes just from normal viewing distance in the corners here. So it is going to be somewhat disruptive. You're not going to want bright stars anywhere in and around the corners, like here, for instance. That's just going to get turned into these bird shapes. So when we looked up here, I did notice that things are out of focus a little bit here towards the edge. And yeah, down here as well. So what you're experiencing there is something called field curvature. And field curvature is referencing where things are in focus. So you can have everything in focus in the center of the frame, but as you go towards the edges or the corners or what have you, you might actually lose focus. And while we do have the astigmatism kind of hiding things a little bit, things are, to my eye, definitely losing focus here in the corners and edges. And again, that's not unsurprising for a nifty 50, but that can affect the star size, and thus that can affect how distracting the edges and corners are compared to the center. So if the center, everything's nice and tight and really clean, and then you get out and it gets into these big blobs and all kinds of bird shapes and stuff, it can be really distracting. So that is there. It is, essentially common in many cases because you're using curved glass elements to try and bend light onto a flat surface. But even though it's hard, that is what a lens has to do. So here, let's just scroll through our apertures and see what happens to the exposure. 1.8, 2, 2.2, 2.5 are getting quite dark. 2.8, very dark. And if we come back through here, I would say F2 is probably optimal. Let's look in the center. F1.8, F2, 2.2, 2.5 is when some of this color fringing finally gets clean. 2.8, color fringing is gone, but so is all of our exposure. And if we come here to the corner, here we have that astigmatism. Let's stop down. F2, it's not really any major change here to it. 2.2, 2.5, it takes until 2.5 for the sagittal to start to rein itself in. 2.8, now the sagittal is roughly the same width as the tangential is in length, and that's still really noticeable. And yeah, it's causing a noticeable change to the star's size there, so I don't know that it's necessarily worth doing that. All that being said, we'll pop into Develop module, come in here on one of these purple fringe stars. The chromatic aberration checkbox doesn't work as is expected, so we come here and sample the purple fringe with the eyedropper, and it gets rid of that purple fringe. We'll look around to make sure there's no weird artifacts, and we're A-OK here. Let's turn on our profile corrections, and yeah, right away it's doing a lot to clean up the vignetting, although it's not getting rid of it perfectly. It's doing a fairly decent job to give you more even exposure here. Also, there's very, 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 very little in way of transformation. So the geometry of this lens is actually pretty distortion free. The edges and corners look like they might be pushed away from the viewer a little bit. And when you enable the profile correction, it looks like they're being flattened out in the direction of the viewer a bit. You're losing like a minute amount of the corners and edges as far as any kind of geometric transformation and cropping. So overall, no reason not to use the profile corrections. It's got to put a little extra effort into the vignetting there maybe, but it does a decent job. That being said, you do want to keep these bright stars away from the edges and corners. They will get all wonky, even out here. So you would want to probably, for optimal image quality, keep things in the center of an APS-C frame if you're using this lens, or not worry about it and just live with it. I'm not the boss of you. You're the boss of you. You decide what you like. There's no right or wrong in art. All right, let's jump out of Lightroom and wrap this up. Well, what'd you think about this? In the surprise of the year, there's no surprises. It performs like I would assume it would perform. And that might be perfectly fine. If it's what you have, use what you got. And this is the type of lens where if I was traveling light, I would possibly put it in the bag instead of something like a much heavier, faster 50 or a much heavier, faster, more telephoto, think like a 80 or something like that, 85, because this lens fits, it's light, you can take it with you, and if you're using a higher megapixel body, you can always crop out some of the edges and that type of thing anyway. So overall, this is probably one of the simpler choices you're ever going to make. It's not that expensive. Maybe it has a place in your bag, maybe it doesn't. In either case, I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully we'll see you in the next one.